and welcome to Outwith, the podcast that takes you beyond the headlines and beyond our borders. I'm Hala Mohideen, and I'm joining you from my kitchen right here in the West End of Glasgow. Now, we appear to be living in the age of Me Too. Or is it the era of Me Too? Or is it a movement or a set of rules and regulations? Well, the US president, when making a campaign stop in Pennsylvania back in October, appeared to mock the so called rules of Me Too, saying he wasn't allowed to say a certain phrase because the rules of Me Too wouldn't allow it. So, what started off, well, for me at least, as a shared status on a Facebook newsfeed has turned into something which is a defining moment, a turning point, an age, an era, and now something with rules. So, what are the rules and what is the age of Me Too? Well, to find out, I'm joined in the kitchen by Eve Livingston, a Glasgow based journalist and columnist who writes on society and women's issues, amongst other things. Eve, welcome to the kitchen.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, Eve, let's just start off with this. What is Me Too?
Well, I think you used the word moment in that introduction, and I think that's how I would see it. I think I would see it as a kind of societal moment. I think it's probably too early to say at the moment whether it's a movement or an age or any of that kind of thing, although they've all been used as descriptors of it. But yeah, I would say it's been this sort of snapshot in time when, and who can say why it was the right time, because it was experiences that women have been sharing for such a long time and getting no traction. But it just so happened, I guess, that all these factors came together at this particular moment and sparked this sort of outpouring of women sharing their experiences. So I think it's a moment, and I think it's about individual women's experiences more than it's about kind of anything wider than that in terms of rules or even policy changes and things.
Okay, so imagine I've just landed here from the moon and I have no idea what you're talking about. So, what is Me Too? It's, tell us how it started and what essentially it is for a complete stranger.
Yeah, well, I mean, it started, the kind of term Me Too in a campaigning context was actually coined in 2006, so what, 11, 12 years ago. And it was a black woman, Tarana Burke, who started that, and it didn't really gain any traction because, as I said before, kind of, I guess the circumstances weren't right, society wasn't ready for that conversation, maybe. But it came to prominence a year ago from an actress, Elisa Milano, following the Harvey Weinstein kind of allegation, the original first one. And she tweeted just something really basic like, if you've ever been harassed or assaulted, reply to this tweet with the term Me Too. And for whatever reason, that sort of captured people's attention and imaginations, and it turned into hashtag Me Too. And it got, a huge amount of, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think it was one of the most used hashtags, if not the most used hashtag of last year on Twitter.
Because that's how I know it. And by the time that I'd shared my own Me Too experience, and it wasn't being, sexually assaulted by a movie producer, but when the hashtag came up on my Facebook feed, it was something simple that if you've, as a woman, if you've experienced harassment, just by simply being a woman, share your experience, hashtag Me Too. And, I was a journalist working in France. Any woman who works in France and takes the metro, you can guarantee has had unwanted attention, or some bloke following them and going, hey, mademoiselle, do you want to come home with me? Or random people calling you a salope on the streets or whatever. So I shared it, and by the time that I shared my experience, it already had one of those little emoticons next to it with lots of hands in the air. So it took off quite a lot. I remember being quite surprised when I saw the amount of my friends who were sharing these experiences. Do you think it was perhaps that caught the imagination, the fact that so many people felt emboldened to share their own experience at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you in saying that some of the people that I saw talking about that weren't my friends who were kind of already engaged in feminist conversations and that kind of thing. So in that sense, it did sort of capture this new audience. And I think you're right. I think there's something about the language of Me Too that's this sort of collaborative solidarity thing. You're not just putting yourself out there alone, you're sort of adding your voice to something. And I think maybe that felt safer for people, and a sort of supportive network was built, because every Me Too sort of sharing story that I saw had all these comments and replies from people saying, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. I had no idea." It wasn't like people were just shouting into the void, because there was this space that had been created to have that conversation. So I think it felt, just a safer environment than women have had before to have those types of discussions.
Okay, so this was my interpretation of it when I heard about, when I first saw the hashtag being shared. It was people sharing their experiences of being harassed. It could be sort of very serious assaults, or it could be, the sort of thing that in France you just accept and you put up with on a daily basis, just people following you or grinding up against you in the subway.
Mm.
It has since then, it appears to have mutated, because I see the age of Me Too, the era of Me Too, the Me Too movement. What has it become? Is there any way to sort of quantify this?
I think what it's become is, within kind of individual industries or cultures or workplaces, um, you've seen it sort of get its nails in, if you like, and dig in. So, for instance, following the, Me Too grew out of the Harvey Weinstein scandal, but following that, there were things in the British Parliament.
Yes.
There were things in India's Bollywood scene. So these kind of particular cultures and things, it sort of got its teeth in there.
Well, let's talk about the specific, let's call them achievements,
Mm.
inverted commas. Just remind us what this Harvey Weinstein scandal is and how it's connected to the Me Too movement.
Yeah, so Harvey Weinstein, sort of, very famous Hollywood producer, essentially he had, for many years, been allegedly having these relationships with women where he was inviting aspiring actresses into his hotel room and touching them inappropriately. I think the allegations range from, kind of harassment and comments right through to a rape allegation, I think, or possibly multiple, actually. And there was just this culture of silence. A lot of people kind of knew about that, had heard stories from other people, and nobody said or did anything. And he was still operating at the top of his game in Hollywood until, some brave people came forward, and it took that kind of one or two voices to spark off everyone else feeling like they then could. And it was just became a barrage of allegations against him, really. And he's had to sort of go into hiding. I mean, he did this brief thing where he came out and said he was going to go to rehab or something, which you see quite a lot with kind of sexual harassers, I think. Say, they're going to go and reform their character because it's their, um, I don't know, kind of comparing it to like a mental illness or something, which I think is problematic. Um, but he's kind of disappeared, and he's potentially facing criminal proceedings in America, although they've got obviously this complicated legal system with a statute of limitations and all of that, and some of these are very historical
It's very much ongoing,
allegations.
the
Yeah.
the legal cases against Harvey Weinstein. You mentioned also the Bollywood industry in India. What's been the
Mm,
effect of the, because India is a country with, let's say, challenges when it comes to
yes.
women and women's rights and the way
Yeah.
women are viewed in society. What's been the effect of this Me Too movement in India?
Yeah, I think this is kind of where the conversation gets quite difficult to start tracing, really, because what's essentially happened in India is that they had sort of historical conversations about harassment within Bollywood, where one particular actress had alleged, being forced into scenes that she didn't want to do, where she was touched inappropriately and that kind of thing. And I think she first spoke about that, I want to say, 7, 8 years ago, many years ago, before Me Too. And it didn't really get any attention or traction. And she sort of spoke out again during the Me Too movement and was able to get that sort of traction. But India, if to take that example, has been having its own reckoning with gender and violence against women for a long time. There was the case in 2014 of that awful rape on a bus, where there were all these victims and the woman was just really brutally attacked, and that made global headlines too. And since then, I think there has been a sort of feminist uprising and a movement and a reckoning with that kind of culture there. So whether Me Too was a separate thing or whether it kind of combined with that force of feeling, I think all these individual cases of what we in the West or the UK exclusively might ascribe to being an effect of Me Too. I think if you were sort of embedded in those countries and those cultures, you might see a number of different forces coming together at once.
So it, it's not just the entertainment industry that's having this reckoning, if you like. We talk about the Bollywood industry, of course, the Harvey Weinstein. It all comes down to issues of power, doesn't it? The power is often in the hands of the movie producers and the bosses, and not in the hands of the people who are on the lower rungs. It's not just Hollywood and Bollywood and the entertainment industry. This goes far more widespread, does it not? You mentioned the British Houses of Parliament. What happened there?
I mean, there were people coming forward who'd worked as sort of parliamentary aides and interns and that kind of thing, coming forward with allegations. I think there was a resignation. I don't have it in front of me.
Was it Michael Fallon?
That Michael Fallon.
He was Defence Secretary at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. He resigned as a result of one of those allegations. And there were plenty of other anonymous accounts coming forward saying that they'd experienced similar things. There's now a sort of ongoing discussion about bullying in the Houses of Parliament, which has pulled in some of that stuff around sexual harassment and assault. There was a Labour activist who came forward to say that she'd been raped at a party conference.
And she said she wasn't taken seriously.
Yes, yeah, I think she joined a lot of women in saying that when that happened to her, there just wasn't any path for her to follow to get any kind of justice, or not even justice, but just to still feel safe in that environment. So she was saying that in the context of the Labour Party, but I think it echoed what a lot of people were saying about the context in which they were speaking up too.
Now, it's interesting we started talking about Michael Fallon, and because he was the most high-profile scalp, if you like, of this this movement and the mea culpas and people saying I've done this wrong, and this case was quite interesting because, for me, it represented almost a sort of a tearing apart of this movement, because there were people, including the woman who he'd allegedly touched inappropriately or spoken to inappropriately, the broadcaster Julie Hartley-Brewer, who'd said this was going too far. She had said, look, this was years ago. Yes, he sort of talked to me inappropriately, and she turned around and said, say that to me again and I'll bop you on the nose or something. And she said, as far as I'm concerned, it's finished. I'm not a victim, and I don't think this guy should be losing his job over something that happened years ago that I'm not that offended by. And her comments struck a nerve with quite a lot of people who were saying, has this movement gone too far? Is there an argument that perhaps it has gone too far and people are being unfairly castigated for what were seemingly innocent remarks or innocent behaviour, certainly behaviour that was almost acceptable 20 or 30 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of accusation of it going too far and tarring good men and all of that stuff, I think that's born out of the very same circumstances in which all this is happening. So the idea that our culture takes it as the worst possible insult and affront to your character to be accused of sexual harassment and assault, but doesn't necessarily take it as seriously when a woman's coming forward saying it's happened to her, that's a really big issue in itself. So, and that's the kind of culture that I think leads to people saying it's gone too far, because they're really worried about men being accused of the worst possible crime that you could ever be accused of. But the women don't get afforded that same level of seriousness when they're talking out about their experiences. So I think that's difficult. And I think the other thing is that if you take MeToo to be a discussion about a culture in general in which violence and harassment sort of operate both to keep women in their place, if you like, and are supported by women being kept in their place. It's this whole kind of amalgamation of different forces that keep the sort of power levels in society where it's at, and violence and harassment is just one of them. If you take MeToo to be a discussion about that, then everything from a sort of comment that made you feel inferior and not able to kind of speak up in a meeting, right through to sexual violence, they're all part of that conversation. They're not necessarily the same things. They don't necessarily have the same long-term traumatic effects on you, but they're all part of a conversation that's about women's experiences of the world and how we navigate situations, right from kind of relationships through to workplaces and all of that stuff. It's all about how power is distributed in society. Everything adds up to a sort of cumulative effect.
But it's not just women who've been speaking up as a result of MeToo. It's not just women who get harassed. It's not just women who get sexually assaulted. And I mean, are we hearing enough from, the men in the story, not just the men who have been the abusers, but the men, there are men who have been abused too. Are they able to speak up as part of this movement?
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult conversation. I would love Me Too to be a place where men can have their voices heard and taken seriously. So the actor Terry Crews spoke out in quite a high profile way about his experience of sexual assault. And I think he was largely very supported, and had a lot of women who'd been involved in the Me Too movement sort of backing him up on that. Um, I think the issue is that men absolutely do face harassment and assault, and as individual men, when that happens to them, it's just as serious as it is for individual women when that happens to us. But as a sort of structural issue, it absolutely does affect women more, statistically. Above 90% of all perpetrators of sexual violence and assault are men, and above 70% of all the recipients of that are women. So there is a sort of structural issue, which I think Me Too kind of has maybe started to have that conversation. I don't think we're there yet. I think a lot of people did interpret it as being about individual experiences. But I think if you look at society as a whole, across all different cultures and countries, it is women who are disproportionately affected by this issue, and it's part of a wider societal kind of organization of power. So I think men have to have spaces to have those conversations and to speak out. But it's sort of a different space. It's a sort of a different issue, and it's the same issue because it's all sexual violence or assault, but it's not necessarily part of this same sort of structural problem.
But is it not time to include men in this conversation? I mean, if the majority of men are the perpetrators of sexual assault and sexual violence, do they not need to be part of this conversation as well? Certainly, a lot of the men I speak to feel quite uncomfortable about this Me Too movement. It's almost like, we'll step back and let people have this space because people who have been attacked and assaulted, it's good for them to speak out. But at the same time, they are now starting to feel attacked too by virtue of being of the same gender. And there's a defensiveness that starts to creep in with not all the men I talk to, but many of them. And I notice certainly a shift in tone. You can feel the temperature drop a couple of degrees when you start to discuss this. And the men feel they can't chip in because they haven't had that experience. And then they start feeling attacked and start feeling a bit more defensive. And I notice a lot in media coverage, you start to see a bit of that backlash kind of moving in. And is there not a danger that we're not bringing men into this conversation early enough and we're attacking rather than being more collaborative?
I have sympathy with individual men who are sort of now thinking, what's my position here? How can I help? What's the right thing to do? But I also think this is just what quite a radical redistribution of power looks like. People who have been used to sort of unearned huge amounts of privilege for centuries, when that's sort of challenged and hopefully redistributed slightly, that it does often feel like discrimination. I mean, it's not though, because discrimination and inequalities and all of those things are about, as I was saying previously, kind of this distribution of power and how things are organized. And that has always affected women more negatively than it's affected men. So I can see on an individual level that men are having to have this reckoning with themselves about how they interact with women or how they support the movement and that kind of thing. But on a structural level, I have limited sympathy for that because I think that's just what it feels like. I'm sure that's what it felt like when civil rights gains were made and white people felt incredibly threatened to have that power taken away, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't have happened, So yes, I think I just think on the level of how do you behave around women, it's not that hard. Yeah, I can see.
We've got men in the room with us, I should say, in case anyone's not watching this. They don't have a microphone on this, so I'll tell them now. But they're all sort of up against the back of the wall like this, like, oh my God.
But I think good men would agree.
Up, chaps. You're allowed.
I think good men would agree that it's not. I'm not saying there are not certain situations where you might sort of think twice or check yourself, but in general, I don't think men are tiptoeing around their girlfriends or their mums being like, "Am I allowed to speak to her?" Like, we've learned how to have individual healthy relationships.
We have, but you'd argue there's still some work to be done, though.
Yes, definitely. And even in relationships, between men and women where there aren't any sort of abuse allegations or that kind of thing, I'm sure there are still sort of instances of where that gender inequality shows, in terms of distribution of like household tasks and things like that. So there's a huge conversation to be had about men and women, how men and women kind of engage with each other.
There's a massive inequality of distribution of household tasks in this house, but unfortunately, it's the other way around. I'm the messy boots, and it's my poor husband that has to go around
Well, that's
cleaning
like
up
a
after
tax.
me.
That's like a patriarchy tax.
Oh, golly, I'm not sure you'd be happy with that. It's not just there's not just tensions within this from the other side, from men. There are tensions within this Me Too. I can see why we call it a movement now, because this is quite a complex sort of many-armed and many-legged, amorphous sort of entity. But there are tensions within this Me Too movement. There have been critics of it, and from women themselves. And I keep referencing France because, of course, it's the blimmin' French behind this. But there was that famous letter that was written by Catherine Deneuve and 99 other prominent French women who were criticising this Me Too movement, saying it had gone too far, and that it felt quite strange, did it not, to have prominent women, and French women are, they'll speak up for themselves, they will stand up, and they were almost defending their right to be hit on by men, chatted up in the street. So it was, that was quite interesting, no? What did you think when you heard about that letter?
I think things like that are difficult. It's like you hear some women sometimes say, I don't have a problem with catcalling. It makes me feel sexy and wanted and all of that kind of thing. And that's a good thing. That's their kind of interpretation of it. And you don't want to be the person that's saying, well, you just don't understand your own experiences, because of course they do. People have different interpretations of the environment that they're in. But I think there's something with Me Too where it grew to these enormous proportions really, really quickly. And suddenly, as a society, we were having all these different conversations about power and about violence and about whether, a kind of wolf whistle on the street is as bad as a sexual assault by Harvey Weinstein in a hotel room. And I think the speed at which the movement grew made it very difficult for people to get to grips with all the sort of nuances and the different elements of that conversation. I disagree with those French women. I respect their right to interpret those situations as they see them, but I feel like the kind of women who perhaps don't have the same level of sort of privilege that those women do, or perhaps just don't feel as tough as individuals, just don't feel like they can, turn around and bonk them on the nose like Julia Hartley-Brewer said. We owe it to those women, I think, to see it as a sort of wider discussion about how things should be and what needs to change and all of that kind of thing.
You raised a really good point here. I feel that this isn't so much about gender, but more about power. And it's more of a structural thing, and that sort of needs to change. But it's also, I'm trying to find the right words here. It's also about what you class as being a victim or not. And that's, I think, certainly from my interpretation of the French letter, the letter from the French ladies, shall we call it, they were very keen not to be portrayed as victims because they enjoyed someone catcalling them in the street, or they said it's rape is a crime, but being chatted up, even in a sort of very clumsy manner, that's not. And, we don't feel like we're victims just because someone wants to compliment us on our appearance and so on. And it's that sense of, what is a victim? And a lot of people certainly don't like thinking that, they are a victim. I don't like to, I shared my experience, which was not a very serious experience, it doesn't feel like, in comparison to what a lot of people have been through. But I felt uncomfortable afterwards thinking, well, I don't think I am a victim. And, I had, 4 blokes, sort of irritating me on one day. But I shrugged it off, and I don't feel like a victim because of that. And I almost changed my mind about putting the thing up there, because I didn't want to feel like I was any kind of victim. And that's where a lot of women tend to come in and criticize this movement, because they don't want to feel like, it's like, poor me, I need someone sticking up for me because I can't stick up for myself. And that feeds into other campaigns that there have been, for example, with equal pay. And this is another thing that, I support equal pay for equal work. I support helping other people, but I don't like the idea that, such and such is only being employed because we need another woman in this department, or I'm being employed because I'm a woman, or I'm being paid such and such because, I want to think that, I don't need that help up. I'm not a victim. I'm not someone who should be pitied. And I should be, treated the same as my male colleagues. So there is a tension there as well, is there not?
Yeah, I think it's to do with this thing of seeing things as we would like them to be and seeing things as they really are. So, I obviously I agree with you about equal pay for equal work, but I guess I would come down differently on the sort of what you're getting at there in terms of quotas and things like that. And I think that's because the way that I perceive the world is that I would love it if we were all just treated equally in the workplace and we were all interviewed and recruited on merit, but I don't think that's what happens. I don't think all of the men who dominate senior positions are better than all the women who went for those positions, because statistically it just doesn't work. What you're saying then is not you, but general you. What we're saying is then that men are just better at pretty much all jobs than women, because they dominate so many of them. So I think we have to look at the world as it is and say, well, there is this huge unequal distribution of power, and it manifests itself in lots of different ways, and one of those ways is being paid less or not getting a senior job, and one of the ways is kind of violence and assault in all these different contexts. And I don't think that women have to identify as victims. I think there's certainly within the women's movement there's been a move towards calling women who've experienced rape and sexual assault survivors rather than victims, which I would probably tend to use because I think it sounds much more powerful and stronger. And I also think that there's just so much strength in kind of numbers and collectivism. So something like MeToo, where you've got all these women coming together and speaking with one voice, that's hugely powerful. I don't think there's anything victimizing about doing that. I think it's, that's why men are so defensive, because they've such a huge display of power there. So I think, I can understand why individual people would have that analysis, but I guess I don't see that there's a huge dilemma there. I think you can identify yourself as whatever you identify yourself as.
And yet feminism seems to be a dirty word for many women. It's one of the, for me, feminism means being equal with a man. Equality. I don't think a man should be treated better than women. I don't think a woman should be treated better than a man. I don't like the idea of quotas for women. I'll be brutally frank with you. I think I'm very much meritocracy all the way. And I understand there are challenges involved in getting people in there, but I would hate to think that I was being offered a job simply because I am a woman, rather than because I am blooming well good at that job. And so for me, but that's where feminism lies. But for a lot of women, feminism is a dirty word. It's about pushing women forward ahead of men, taking the feelings of women into account before you think about the feelings of men. It's all about Me Too all the way, setting fire to bras, if that's something people still do. But it's very much that kind of militant, talking in sentences of words I don't understand, like intersectional, this, that, the next thing. Like it's all very, and it feels quite exclusive, and that's not something that that I can understand why people wouldn't want to be a part of that. Is there not is feminism a dirty word? Are people turning away from it?
I think it's become less of a dirty word kind of within my adult lifetime. I'm 26, so I think of when I was a teenager at school, and I would absolutely never have, I don't know, I can't remember if I was interested in feminism at that time, but I would never have said it if I was. Whereas my sister is 11 years younger than me, so she's that age now, and she's got friends who talk about feminism and have feminist discussions at school, and that's one of their kind of big hobbies, and I think that's amazing, and it's such a difference from when I was that age, and it's also becoming increasingly sort of commercial and marketable. So you get sort of T-shirts in Topshop that have like #feminist and stuff emblazoned on them, and
Which I would never wear.
Well, that's it. I don't love that for a lot of different reasons. I wouldn't walk around wearing it, and I also think that sort of social movements that are then co-opted to make money are kind of inherently problematic. But that's a whole other discussion.
That's another podcast.
But I think things are getting better. I think one of the reasons that feminism has been seen as a dirty word is exactly the reason it's needed. It's about women sort of talking loudly and having a voice that's being heard and sharing experiences that are not comfortable for society at large. And so it's in the sort of, I don't like using the word patriarchy. I sort of always just use it in an ironic way because it just
makes
sounds,
me think of people
so
burning bras.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good word. I think it's a perfect word for describing what it is, but it just sounds so kind of silly and grandiose. But I think it's in the interest of the patriarchy to have people thinking feminism's a dirty word, so that they don't get involved in it and they keep things the way that they are.
Is anything changing? Is any of this working? Because, we're coming to the tail end of 2018. Donald J. Trump is in the White House, and he was elected thanks to many women in the US who voted for him. Women who think MeToo has gone too far, who think feminism is a dirty word, and all sorts of things. We have Judge Kavanaugh, who has been nominated and who has been sworn in as a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. That's an event which divided opinion worldwide, but one of the arguments made for the way Justice Kavanaugh was brought onto the Supreme Court was because he felt attacked and spoke up loudly in favour of his rights, and people were condemning the fact that he was being slandered by women accusing him of whatnot. So this is all coming in the midst of this MeToo movement, this MeToo era. We've just come off the back of the midterms. We're seeing more women in being elected to Congress, but still, the GOP is still very much in charge of the Senate. Donald Trump doesn't look like he's going anywhere. How much of an impact has all of this, any of this, had?
I suppose this is where I get a bit pessimistic about it, really, which is that I think it's had a huge impact for women kind of within themselves in terms of feeling like they can share experiences and speak up for themselves. But in terms of the impact that it's had on society at large, that hasn't caught up, I don't think, with the speed at which women are kind of feeling emboldened. So I did it's been a bit delayed now, but I started working on an article about how MeToo had affected women's everyday lives, because it felt like a lot of the year anniversary coverage was about particular industries or sort of cultural settings and that kind of thing. And I wanted to just ask normal everyday women, has it affected your life? And I got loads of responses, but they were almost exclusively women saying, yeah, it affected me because I recognized something to be abusive or assault or whatever, and I spoke up about it, or I recognized my workplace to not be a safe environment for women, and I did this and that. But it was all women sort of taking the onus on themselves to speak up and make a change, and not really necessarily seeing any results from that. I think the Brett Kavanaugh thing's such a good example, because it's one of the most horrifying things I've ever watched, that poor woman having to give her testimony. And it's awful to think that happened a year after this movement that everyone was hailing as the sort of change that society needed to see. So I think it's had an impact on women themselves that shouldn't be underestimated. Even in terms of, there was a strike by McDonald's workers in America over sexual harassment, for instance, and their union walked out over that. And I think they're the stories that we don't necessarily hear because they're not these powerful, kind of glamorous women with big voices already. But they're where the change probably will really happen, if we can get the sort of Me Too conversation into things like trade unions and that kind of thing, which I think is starting to happen. So I'm optimistic that it could have an impact. I think all these women sort of finding their voices kind of has to have an impact, but it's not, in my eyes, sort of taken off yet. I hope that's what's going to come down the line.
Okay, so there's more to it than just popping a hashtag on your Facebook feed. It is very much the start of something, not the be all and the end all.
Absolutely. I think women have to, once they've found that voice and that solidarity and strength, they have to then get into, trade unions and campaigns and that kind of thing, and make sure that those voices stay being heard by the people who can actually make a difference. So I hope it's the beginning of something.
Okay, Eve, we're going to wrap this up, but before we do, is there anything else that you think that we should be talking about around this sort of subject? Is there anything you think we should be aware of?
I think I kind of got to it at the end there. I think it's the kind of relationship of Me Too to all these grassroots campaigning and to women who don't have a lot of visibility and don't have a lot of power. So kind of, women in low paid work and um, unpaid carers and all of these women who are kind of working at the margins of our society in jobs where they're very vulnerable and having a really difficult time, but they don't have the same visibility that Hollywood actresses and things do. So I think we really need to make sure that we're including them and hearing their voices, and that we keep an eye on sort of women trade union activism and grassroots campaigns and things like that, as well as these big sensational headline grabbing stories.
Yeah, very easy to talk about Harvey Weinstein and Ross McGowan. It's I know you've been skirting around it, but there is obviously an ongoing story here in Glasgow with the women who are in low-paid jobs who are currently at loggerheads trying to get an equal pay settlement out of Glasgow City Council. This is something that's been rumbling on for quite some time. I think it's a multi-billion-pound payout that's they're kind of looking for, and it's. Yeah, that's another one that's ongoing. So hopefully we'll have you back to talk about that when we're any further forward with it. But yes, no, it's these kind of stories that we're wanting to talk about on the podcast. The stories that aren't getting into the news bulletins on a daily basis. And yes, Me Too has been drifting in and out of the headlines, but it's good to actually have a more in-depth conversation to break it down a little bit. I hope this has been useful for everyone who's been listening. Thank you so much, Eve, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
If you want to hear more from Eve or see more of her work, do check it out. Her website is everebeccalivingston.com. That's Livingston without an E. We'll pop that in the bio when we send this out on social media. Eve's also on Twitter as Eve_Rebecca, and her work's regularly published across the British and internationally, I understand. Certainly The Guardian is where you can hear more from Eve. And remember, if you're enjoying these conversations, do get in touch with us. We love hearing from you. We are at Outwith Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well. Hopefully you'll see our photos on Instagram. Do get in touch. Leave us a review on the podcast app you get your podcast from. And if you can think of any subjects that you want us to discuss and go into more detail, do let us know. Subscribe, get in touch, and we will hopefully catch you on another episode coming to you very soon. Thanks very much, everyone.